A man who refuses to follow the same rules as everyone else is exactly how a neighborhood begins to lose its standards. That was what Marla Prewitt, president of the Homeowners Association, said into the microphone. Then she looked down at the violation list and read Hank Bowen's name. Hank was sitting in the third row. His 10-year-old daughter, Josie, was beside him in her wheelchair. She heard the president describe her father as the kind of man who dragged a neighborhood down. Her hands tightened around the armrests. Then she lowered her eyes toward the wheels of her chair. Some of the neighbors turned to look at Hank. A few stared only long enough to recognize him, then faced forward again. The man in the first row nodded, as though Marla had confirmed something he already believed. Hank did not stand. He did not interrupt her. Inside his jacket was a folded county survey. Behind it was the approval letter the board claimed had never existed. He was not waiting for the room to become kinder. He was waiting for the one person at the board table whose job was to read before she agreed. Hank Bowen had laid stone for almost 40 years. Patios retaining walls. Walkways built straight enough to hold their line through winter. The work had left his hands rough and one side of his back permanently stiff. He had raised Josie alone since she was 6. She had used a wheelchair for most of her life. The chair was not what made their house difficult. The 3 concrete steps at the front door did. For years, every trip in or out required planning, lifting and asking someone else for help. Hank wanted his daughter to be able to enter her own home without waiting for him. So he built a ramp. He measured the grade. He poured proper footings. He installed a rail strong enough to carry an adult's full weight. And before he mixed the first load of concrete, he followed the association's process. He submitted an accommodation request. The office stamped his copy when it was received. The architectural committee approved the plan in writing. Hank kept that letter. He also pulled the recorded survey of his lot from the county, because part of the proposed ramp ran near the edge of the property. He knew men like him were rarely granted the benefit of a missing document, so he kept every one. 2 years later, a new board took office. Marla Prewitt became president. Her first newsletter promised consistent enforcement. Her first meeting introduced a violation report organized by street. By June, the letters began arriving at Hank's house. The ramp was described as an unapproved exterior structure. The notice claimed part of it extended into a common setback. The fine was $50 a day. If the ramp remained after 14 days, the association could arrange for its removal and add the cost to Hank's account. If the balance remained unpaid, the notice warned, the board could pursue a lien against his home. Hank responded with a copy of the approval letter. The board replied that it had no record of the committee action. He sent it again, this time with the stamped receipt from his original application. The second reply said the matter would be resolved at the annual meeting. That was how Hank and Josie ended up in a crowded clubhouse during the yearly dues vote. At the board table beside Marla sat a woman Hank had never seen before. She had the association's governing documents open beside the meeting packet. Whenever Marla referred to a rule, the woman checked the page and wrote something in the margin. The nameplate in front of her said Association Council. Hank felt the folded survey inside his jacket. He left it there. Marla moved through the agenda efficiently. Landscaping, parking, holiday decorations. Then she reached the enforcement report. A photograph of Hank's ramp appeared on the screen. Marla spoke first about consistency, then community appearance, then property values. She said rules meant nothing if each homeowner could decide when they applied. Her voice stayed calm. That made the words land harder. Then she looked directly at Hank. "This is what happens," she said, When one resident decides his personal circumstances are more important than the process everyone else follows. Josie pressed both palms flat against her armrests. Hank saw it. He also saw the voluntary compliance agreement waiting at the edge of the board table. Marla explained the offer as though she were doing him a kindness. If Hank signed it, the board would waive the accumulated fine. He would have 30 days to remove the ramp. Josie could use the shared accessibility path at the far end of the block. The path ended beside the community mailbox. It did not connect to Hank's house. Between the mailbox and his porch were 200 feet of uneven grass, a curb, and 3 concrete steps. There was no paved route a wheelchair could use. Marla placed the agreement in front of Hank. She set a pen on top of it. "Sign tonight," she said, "and this does not have to become more difficult than it already is." Hank looked at the signature line. The fine increased while he slept. The lien warning was printed in bold. For one moment, signing felt less like surrender than relief. He picked up the pen. Then Josie looked at him. She did not ask what he was going to do, she only watched. Hank placed the pen back on the agreement. He slid the document away from him. Then he stood. "I'd like the board to review 2 records before it votes," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. He walked to the front of the room. From his jacket, he removed the folded county survey and placed it beneath the microphone. He opened it carefully and pressed the creases flat. A raised county seal sat near the lower corner. "The violation says my ramp crosses the common setback," Hank said. "It does not." He pointed to the recorded boundary line. "The board measured from this line here." Then he moved his finger to the marked boundary on the survey. "My property ends here." The 2 lines were several feet apart. Marla leaned toward the microphone. Hank placed the approval letter beside the survey before she could speak. "This is the accommodation approval from the architectural committee," he said. "It has the date, the committee's signatures, and the plan number." He added the stamped submission receipt. "And this is the copy showing when the request was filed." Marla looked toward the association council. The council was already reading. She checked the county seal. She checked the parcel number against the address printed on the violation notice. Then she compared the ramp drawing attached to the approval letter with the structure shown on the screen. Nobody hurried her. For the first time that night, Marla was not controlling the pace of the meeting. The council placed one hand on the survey. "This appears to be the recorded survey for Mr. Bowen's parcel," she said. She looked toward the treasurer. "Is this the same parcel number the association used when issuing the violation?" Doug checked the notice. "Yes." The council pointed to the boundary. "Then the setback measurement in the violation was taken from the wrong line." The man in the first row stopped nodding. The council lifted the approval letter. "This document also appears to show prior written approval for the ramp and includes the signatures of the committee serving at that time." Marla reached for the microphone. "That committee was careless about enforcement." The council turned toward her. "That may be your opinion of the committee." She tapped the approval letter once. "It does not make the signed approval disappear." The whispering near the back wall stopped. Doug's pen remained pressed to the meeting minutes in the middle of an unfinished word. A woman across the aisle lowered her printed agenda into her lap. The council continued. "My advice is that the board suspend enforcement immediately, withdraw the violation, and remove the associated fines." Marla's face tightened. "We still have an obligation to apply the rules consistently." "Yes," the council said, "and consistency begins with identifying the actual rule being enforced." She pulled the violation notice toward her. "Which covenant or architectural standard is listed as the basis for this charge?" Marla looked down. Below the description of the alleged violation was a line marked governing provision. The line was empty. Marla's signature was beneath it. The council waited. Marla turned one page in the meeting packet, then another. What provision did the board determine Mr. Bowen violated? The counsel asked. Marla did not answer. The counsel's voice stayed professional. The survey places the ramp on his parcel. The association previously approved the modification. The notice does not identify the provision supporting the fine. And the board has now been shown that this is an accessibility modification for a child who resides in the home. She closed the governing documents. Continuing enforcement after reviewing these records would create serious legal exposure for the association. Marla looked at the approval letter again, then at the photograph of the ramp still displayed behind her, then at Hank. An hour earlier, she had used his name as evidence that the neighborhood was losing its standards. Now the entire room was waiting for her to say what the records showed. Marla moved the microphone closer. "The violation against Mr. Bowen is withdrawn," she said. "The daily fines are void." She paused. Doug looked up from the minutes. Marla continued. "The board should have verified the property record and the prior approval before issuing the notice." Hank did not smile. He did not ask her to apologize again. He looked at the survey, the approval letter, and the unsigned compliance agreement lying on the same table. "I followed the process the association gave me," he said. "I needed the board to follow it too." The council recommended one additional action. The accommodation should be entered into the official meeting minutes and attached to the property file so that a future board could not issue the same violation again. The board voted. No one objected. Doug crossed out the violation in the minutes. Then the clerk read the correction into the record. "The accessibility ramp at the Bowen residence is recognized as an approved accommodation." She turned the page. "The violation is withdrawn. The fines are void. The ramp will remain." Josie raised her hand. The movement was small, but the clerk noticed it. "Yes?" she asked. Josie looked from the clerk to her father. "Does that mean nobody can make Dad tear it down?" The clerk glanced at the association counsel. The counsel nodded. "That is what it means." Josie sat a little straighter. "Can you say that part again?" The clerk looked down at the minutes. "The ramp will remain." No one in the room misunderstood the words the second time. Later that night, Hank unfolded the survey on his kitchen table and placed the approval letter back inside its envelope. He did not frame either one. He returned them to the folder where he kept tax receipts, repair invoices, and every other paper a working man learns not to lose. Outside, Josie rolled toward the ramp. She reached the bottom without waiting for Hank. Then she pushed herself up the smooth concrete grade. At the top, she turned and looked back toward him. The small approval marker Hank had attached to the post 2 years earlier was still there. It had been there through every letter, through every fine, through every claim that he had ignored the rules. The board had not discovered that Hank deserved an exception. It had finally been forced to acknowledge that he had followed the process before any of them accused him of breaking it. So who carried the greater responsibility that night? The president who signed a violation she had not verified, or the neighbors who heard Hank's name used publicly and never once asked to see the rule? Tell me which one you believe mattered more.